Hi everyone! Today we're going to look at a few more tips in designing effective charts, and also you can think of those as a practitioner's guide. So when you're designing things or using figures in your presentation or papers, what would you want to be careful about? So we'll start with colors. So colors, as we mentioned, can be really effective, but we should be using color carefully. So my recommendation is that you often would want to start with grayscale or black and white. And after you have a very good content and layout, then you start to gradually add in color for emphasis. So starting with grayscale is a very good starting point because it forces you to focus on the content and layout instead of the color choices. And for fonts, I would suggest using sans serif. So sans serif meaning the font that do not have the small features at the end of the strokes. And sans serif usually tend to be simpler and easier to look at. So if you're using a Mac like me, then the font Helvetica is a great start. For Windows, I believe that would be Arial. And for animation, similar to our use of colors, I would recommend starting with no animation. That will also forces you to focus on the content and layout. And after that, then you gradually add in the more meaningful animation. So animation can be really effective, especially you want to convey the transition or the dynamics of your data. And those cases, animation may be a good idea. But you want to think very carefully about those before you're applying them. So charts are actually one of the many kinds of pictures that you can use. Pictures include tables, diagrams, and charts. And I recommend using pictures, and even better would be video. It's because pictures often are more succinct and memorable, and also people like to see pictures, and even more so for movies. And pictures are great because you can attract people's attention so that they don't fall asleep. And because once people fall asleep, it's really hard to wake them up. So general rule of thumb is when you have good stuff, show them right away. Going along the same lines, when using pictures, how do we use pictures effectively, let's say in a paper? So this is what I call a crown jewel image that you might want to consider including in a paper. So crown jewel image meaning is give you an overview of the whole paper or the whole project. And in this example, this crown jewel image is showing the main idea of this work. So if you look at the title, it says scene completion using millions of photographs. And while in the crown jewel figure, you'll see it's a series of 4 images. And it actually very, very succinctly, very nicely done. It conveyed the meaning of that scene completion. So it says that from the left, in the beginning, we start with original image. And then the second image there, we're saying that there's a portion of the image we want to remove. And then the third one, we will say, we are using a lot of images, looking at a lot of images. And then we do what we call scene matches. And using those images, then we fill out the part that we want to remove from our original image. So the fourth one, the one to the right, is the output. So here you're just looking at this series of animation, if you would. You can already get a very good idea about what this paper is about. So this is what I call a very good and effective crown jewel image. So in general, for every project, every presentation, you should try and come up with something like this. So this is really what I call a cut to the chase. So give an overview, tell people what they're going to get right off the bat so that they don't need to figure out or they don't need to wait. And the main reason you want to do this is because people often skim and they tend to look at the most interesting thing first. And if you're a researcher or PhD students, then this is particularly important because you were submitting this for review, let's say to a conference. Often reviewers, they are very busy and they can assign like 5 to 10 or even more papers to read. So it's really great for your paper to stand out. And having a crown jewel image is a very effective way to do that. And in practice, how do you pick the figure is that you can use your most impressive figures and put it up front. And it doesn't mean that you do not want to show that figure again. You can actually show that figure again, maybe provide more information. So that means a crown jewel image, maybe the most compelling, most impressive thing that we want to show. And then later on, you want to provide more detail. Including the crown jewel figure, any figures that you design, you should have the figure to be what I call self-contained. So meaning if someone were to skim between these figures or like flip through the pages of the report or jump through it different slides of a presentation, they should still be able to get the main message of what you want to say in the image by just looking at the image and its caption. The main reason is because people skim, right? So people skim, and also even if they don't skim, if you only provide very little information in the caption of the figure, then you will force people to go back and forth, jumping back and forth. And you may be able to tell from your experience reading a book, jumping back and forth between pages is actually not very good idea. It slows you down, and it probably even confuses you. So making every figure self-contained is very important. And also because figures are often the very first thing that people will be looking at. So having very hard to read, requiring people to jump back and forth would give a very bad first impression. So how do we fix that? To fix that is to think about what is the main takeaway message that you want to convey. So here on the right, I'll zoom in a little bit, is an example of what I call a self-contained image. So you can ignore what the chart is showing. So this is actually a little more technical. But even just skimming it, looking at the caption, here we said that the ROC curves of 7 iteration and true positive rate incrementally improved. So then the main message here is to show that some kind of numbers, here we say true positive rate, incrementally improves over 7 iterations. So that's our main message. So this is pretty easy to understand. And also in the figure itself, you will see that we clearly label iteration 1 to 7. And then also we point at each line, at each iteration. And vertically, we highlight the improvement from 0.849 to 0.871. So this is what I would call an example of self-contained image, where just looking at the figure itself, looking at the caption, I already get a main message about what I want to convey. So to put everything together, the crown jewel and also the self-contained principle, then often what you see in presentation or in papers like this is that we put the figure on the first page and often at the upper right corner, or maybe even extending and taking up the full first row or the upper half of a paper. If you're given a presentation, a very good first rule is to use legible fonts. So the main reason is because if people cannot see it, then they would not appreciate it. So that means no matter how impressive the things that you want to show, if they cannot see it, well, it doesn't really matter. So for printed material, I recommend that you actually print them out, because on screen, you may be zooming into the text and everything seems legible. But once you print them out, then maybe the font size may be actually too small. So for presentation, the rule of thumb is that you might want to fit about 7 lines of text on a slide. So again, this is a rule of thumb. It isn't really a rule that you cannot break. But in general, for legibility, especially if we're showing the presentation in a large lecture hall, for example, then the 7 line of text rule of thumb is a very good one to follow. And when you are putting figures in presentations, then you may find that you often may need to recreate the figure. So here we're showing you a figure in a paper where we show not only the exact values of the bars, but we also show the error bars. But if we were to put this figure, let's say, in presentation, then we likely don't want to put all these numbers there. Instead, we must want to come up with something like this, where you will notice that we removed the error bars, we removed the values, and also we simplify the title too. Because the main message that we want to convey here is that whatever tool that we're developing, in this case Apollo, is better. So that means the main message is we are faster, we are better, and the Apollo software wins. So in this case, you see that we added a big arrow to help convey the main message. And the last tip is about presentation. So presentation is extremely important, and it is an advertisement of your work. So it's probably also the very first time that someone else sees your work. So it doesn't really matter how great your work is. If they do not understand your presentation, then it doesn't really matter, because they have never heard about what you do, and this is the first time, and you are not really selling it very well. So there's actually excellent videos also from a comedy, stand-up comedy, from Don McMillan. So I highly recommend that you look at it. It's not only funny, but it's also very, very informative. For example, we look at how bad color schemes can affect readability. For example, having black text on a very dark red, extremely hard to read. And also using bad or tiny fonts, very hard to read. Too much animation can distract people from the main message, or maybe even putting too much data. So this is actually often a very first thing that a lot of first-time presenter may run into, is that they try to cram everything into presentation. And it's not a very good idea, because that just makes everything not very easy to read. So same rule here. You are putting a lot of things, and you're basically emphasizing everything. So think carefully about what you want to put on the screen. So in this video, we'll look at some of the practical tips of how to improve figures and presentations.